Introduction: Gaddafi's challenge to global power dynamics. In 2009, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi delivered a speech at the United Nations General Assembly that shook the foundations of the global diplomatic community. This speech, laden with bold and unapologetic criticisms, exposed what he perceived as the inherent flaws and inequalities within the United Nations UN. Gaddafi's rhetoric was not just a critique of the UN, but a challenge to the global power dynamics maintained by a few dominant nations. His controversial statements highlighted the motivations behind the desire to remove him from power, revealing the extent to which the UN serves the interests of a select few rather than the collective welfare of its members. The United Nations, a flawed institution. In his speech, Gaddafi emphasized the disparity between the UN's lofty ideals and its operational realities. He likened the UN to Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park, where individuals speak without the expectation that their words will lead to any concrete action. "We are 192 nations and countries, and we are like Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park. We just speak and nobody implements our decisions," he declared. This metaphor underscored the perceived impotence of the General Assembly, contrasting sharply with the power wielded by the Security Council's permanent members. The formation of the United Nations and its discontents. Gaddafi traced the roots of the UN's current structure to its formation at the end of World War II. The organization was founded by a coalition of victorious nations, primarily the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and China, against Germany and its allies. These founding members established the Security Council, granting themselves permanent membership and veto power. This arrangement, Gaddafi argued, created an unequal power structure that favored a few nations at the expense of the majority. The United Nations was founded by 3 or 4 countries against Germany at the time, Gaddafi noted. Those countries formed a body called the Security Council, made its own countries permanent members, and granted them the power of veto. This historical context highlighted the exclusion of many nations from the initial formation of the UN, setting the stage for ongoing disparities in representation and influence. Veto power and global inaction. One of the most contentious issues Gaddafi addressed was the veto power held by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom. This veto power allows these nations to block any resolution, often leading to inaction on critical international crises. For instance, in the case of Syria, Russia and China repeatedly vetoed resolutions aimed at reducing violence and addressing humanitarian concerns. Similarly, the United States has used its veto power to block resolutions related to Israel and Palestine. The preamble of the Charter states that all nations, small or large, are equal, Gaddafi stated. Are we equal when it comes to the permanent seats? No, we are not equal. This fundamental inequality, he argued, undermines the very principles upon which the UN was founded and perpetuates a system where powerful nations can act with impunity. The reality of international conflict and the UN's role. Gaddafi pointed out the stark contrast between the UN's mission to maintain international peace and the reality of global conflicts. Since the UN's establishment in 1945, he noted, 65 wars had broken out, resulting in more deaths than World War II. These conflicts, he argued, were often driven by the interests of a few powerful nations rather than the collective good of the international community. The preamble also states that if armed force is used, it must be a United Nations force, thus military intervention by the United Nations with the joint agreement of the United Nations, he emphasized. However, the reality, he argued, was that military interventions were often carried out unilaterally or by coalitions of powerful nations, bypassing the collective decision-making process of the UN non-interference and sovereignty. Gaddafi also highlighted the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of states, which is enshrined in the UN Charter. No country, therefore, has the right to interfere in the affairs of any government, be it democratic or dictatorial, socialist or capitalist, reactionary or progressive, he declared. This principle, he argued, was frequently violated by powerful nations using the UN as a tool to further their own geopolitical interests. The senators of Rome once appointed their leader Julius Caesar as dictator because it was good for Rome at that time, Gaddafi remarked, drawing a historical parallel. Just as the Romans acted in their own interest, modern nations use the UN to legitimize their interventions under the guise of humanitarian concerns, or the responsibility to protect. The need for UN reform. Central to Gaddafi's speech was a call for comprehensive reform of the UN. He argued that the current structure of the Security Council, dominated by a few powerful nations, was inherently undemocratic and needed to be overhauled. The solution is to foster democracy at the level of the General Congress of the World, the General Assembly, to which the powers of the Security Council should be transferred, he proposed. In this vision, the Security Council would become an executive body implementing the decisions of the General Assembly, which would serve as the true legislative body of the international community. African representation and historical injustice. Gaddafi placed particular emphasis on the need for African representation within the Security Council. He argued that Africa's historical experiences of colonization, exploitation, and marginalization warranted a permanent seat on the council. Africa was colonized, isolated and persecuted, and its rights usurped. Its people were enslaved and treated like animals, and its territory was colonized and placed under trusteeship, he stated. This historical debt, he argued, must be acknowledged and rectified through greater representation within the UN's decision-making structures. Conclusion: a legacy of controversy and change. Gaddafi's speech at the UN General Assembly was a bold and controversial critique of the international order. It highlighted the deep-seated inequalities and power imbalances within the UN, calling for a comprehensive overhaul of its structures and practices. His speech resonated with many nations, particularly in the developing world, who shared his frustrations with the status quo. However, Gaddafi's outspoken critique also made him a target for those invested in maintaining the current global power dynamics. The subsequent intervention in Libya by NATO, under the guise of humanitarian intervention, led to his downfall and death in 2011. This intervention, Gaddafi argued, was not about protecting civilians, but about removing a leader who challenged the authority of powerful nations. In the end, Gaddafi's speech remains a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggle for a more equitable and just international order. It calls into question the effectiveness of the UN in fulfilling its mission and underscores the need for continued efforts to reform and democratize global governance. Whether one views Gaddafi as a visionary leader or a controversial figure, his critique of the UN continues to provoke thought and debate about the future of international relations and the quest for global justice.
Hey everyone! If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Want to be the first to know when we upload a new video? Tap the notification bell. And we love hearing from you. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and questions. Lastly, share this video with your friends who are passionate about the social issues affecting the African continent.